The Matrix is older than you know. I prefer counting from the emergence of one integral anomaly to the emergence of the next, in which case this is the sixth version.
5 ones before me. There are only 2 possible explanations. There were 5 ones before me. Either no one told me, or no one knows.
Precisely.
Can't make me do anything, white prick!
Choice. The problem is choice.
Humans are wrong to believe they are superior just because they have consciousness. Because even if we can understand how the world works according to the principle of causality we mentioned earlier, we remain fundamentally incapable of grasping its deeper meaning. We figured out some things about the world, gravity, fluid mechanics, the evolution of species, etc. But the deeper meaning of existence escapes us. The deeper meaning of reality escapes us. We know how the world works, at least in part, but we still don't know why the world exists. Why is there something rather than nothing? That's the great metaphysical question posed by Leibniz, and it's a question we cannot answer. So, it's all well and good to say that we are superior animals capable of understanding how the world around us works. But the reality is, we only understand the surface of our world. To truly grasp the world in its essence, in its depth, we would need to penetrate the will of the world, and that we are structurally incapable of doing. So, if the will is inaccessible to us, if it's impossible to know anything about it, then what can we say about it? Isn't Schopenhauer contradicting himself by talking about a world he claims we can't say anything about? Well, not exactly. Remember what I mentioned earlier. I said that the world as representation is an expression of the world as will. Let me use a different word instead of expression. Manifestation. The world as representation is a manifestation of the world as will. And we, as human beings, as products of the world, as beings born from the world, are manifestations of the will. So if we were able to truly know ourselves, we would also be able to know an aspect of the will, the aspect under which the will manifests itself through us. Does that make sense? So, what does man know about himself? He knows he's alive. That's the most basic thing about being human. We're alive. I'm pretty sure I'm not telling you anything new. Now, if we ask the question, why do we live? Well, that's where things get more complicated. You might be tempted to say, we live because we live. What more is there to say? We live because, about 4 billion years ago, amino acids formed from organic matter. Those amino acids combined to form proteins. And through interactions with their environment, those proteins gave rise to complex structures capable of reproducing. That's the origin of life. Great. But why did this happen? Why these amino acids? Why these proteins? Why life? In other words, we know how life appeared. But we don't know why life appeared. And to that why, Schopenhauer has an answer. The will. It is the will that makes life exist. Everything that exists comes from the will. And what do we know about life? We know that its fundamental characteristic is to seek to perpetuate itself. And in animals, how does life perpetuate itself? Well, it perpetuates through the instinct of reproduction. All animals have the instinct to reproduce. And that instinct is just one part of a bigger instinct, the instinct for self-preservation, or what we also call the survival instinct. Now, why is the instinct to reproduce a part of the survival instinct? Because, on a collective level, at the level of the species, not reproducing means condemning oneself to extinction. If we stopped reproducing right now, in about 100 years, humanity would no longer exist. So from a strictly biological point of view, the sexual act isn't just about pleasure. Its main purpose is to preserve the species, to safeguard it. And that's something we need to keep in mind. So, let's go back to life. We don't know the purpose of life. But perhaps the question doesn't even make sense. The only purpose of life that we know for sure is self-perpetuation. Life seeks to perpetuate itself indefinitely, and to do that, it drives us to reproduce. Well, That's what the will is. A blind, absurd force that seeks to perpetuate itself indefinitely. And for that, it takes the form of what Schopenhauer calls the will to live. And we, as living beings, are the instruments of this will to live. We are instruments of the will, which needs us to perpetuate itself. By reproducing, we give life to the will, so to speak, in the sense that we extend its existence by extending our own. In itself, the will is impersonal. As I mentioned earlier, the will is a blind force. But it's a blind force that incarnates itself. It incarnates itself in living species and in the individuals that make up these species. In this sense, every living being participates in the will, since every living being is endowed with an instinct for survival, conservation, and reproduction, which allows it to perpetuate the will while also perpetuating itself. Okay, I know my argument might sound a bit strange to you, because in our everyday lives, we don't really think about it that way. We don't go around thinking that when we want to have kids, it's to keep the will going. We just think we want kids to watch them grow, raise them, and love them. We don't see it as following the will. We see it as something we simply want to do. But Schopenhauer says that's just an illusion. We hide the fact that we're biologically programmed, meaning driven by the will to reproduce, behind all the talk about how great it is to become parents and how much we love our kids. And when I say hide, I don't mean we're doing it on purpose. We're not even aware of it. We don't realize that by having kids, we're actually just helping to keep the will going. Can you imagine if, right before having sex, you thought, I'm working for the will. I'm about to contribute to the perpetuation of the will to live. That would be pretty awkward. And yet, that's exactly what's happening. Each of us is an individual agent of the will. And when we decide to have children, when we decide to reproduce, we aren't aware that, in fact, we're just instruments of the will, which uses us as a way to perpetuate itself. So, what bugs us about this idea? What really bothers us is that it takes away our sense of free will. It turns us into nothing more than instruments of the will. What Schopenhauer tells us is that we aren't really free. We aren't free in the sense that we're determined by the will to want what we want, to decide what we decide, and to do what we do. In fact, the example of sexuality fits perfectly. When we feel sexual desire for someone, it's not something we choose. It's a force from deep within us that takes hold of us. Sexual desire isn't rational or thought out. It's a drive that is the source of life, which means it's the source of our desire to have children. Today, we tend to separate sexual desire from reproduction because we've invented contraception. With contraception, we can engage in sex without the risk of having children. But for millions of years, sexuality and reproduction weren't separate. They were linked. Having sex inherently carried the risk of having children. So there was a good reason to think twice. A good reason to control our impulses, rather than letting our impulses control us. So we aren't free. As individuals, we aren't free because we unknowingly obey the all-powerful will. And if we think we're free, it's precisely because we aren't aware that we're working for the will. If we were aware, maybe we'd stop working for it. Maybe we'd stop reproducing, stop participating in the fundamental absurdity of existence as an act of defiance. But the truth is, we don't know. Some of you might know the movie The Usual Suspects. In the movie, 5 criminals are being questioned by the police about a massacre that happened on a boat. At one point, the name of the person responsible for the massacre comes up. Kaiser Soze. Kaiser Soze is the figure of a criminal who terrifies everyone, including other criminals, because he's as intelligent as he is ruthless. The peculiarity of Kaiser Soze is that the people who work for him don't know they're working for him. They can meet him, talk to him, even interrogate him, and never realize he's Kaiser Soze. Or they figure it out when it's already too late. Well, the will is like Kaiser Soze. It makes individuals work in the world of representation without telling them, without even letting them realize it. And yet, they do. They do it willingly. What's more effective than getting people to work, not because you ask them to, but because they want to? When we reproduce, when we have kids, we do it willingly. We don't feel like we're doing it for someone else or for some other reason. That's the trick. The will doesn't tell us it's there, but it's still running the show. Think about it. Life has no real purpose, but we keep reproducing it. Life has no meaning, but we still want to live. Isn't that pretty much the definition of absurdity? And this brings us to a very interesting aspect of Schopenhauer's philosophy. The question of love. So what is love? Well, it probably won't surprise you to hear that. For Schopenhauer, love is just another illusion. It's a trick the will plays on us to make sure we keep the species going, to make sure we agree to the never-ending cycle of life. What happens when we're in love? When we're in love, we want to unite with the person we love, in every sense of the word. And from that love, a child will be born. Love, then, is the means by which the will ensures its own perpetuation. Now, you might say, but love isn't what makes us reproduce. It's sexual desire that makes us reproduce. Yes, but for Schopenhauer, love and sexual desire are essentially the same thing. Or rather, love is the culturally acceptable form of sexual desire. I mentioned earlier that man is an animal, but he's an animal that refuses to accept his own animality. Even though we know, biologically speaking, that we are animals, there's something in us that refuses to accept this. It's like we want to be more than animals. The idea that we could behave exactly like animals, copulating instinctively and leaving behind offspring, is something our conscience can't bear. But for Schopenhauer, that's just vanity, pride, another illusion. Ultimately, what is human intelligence, if not the ability to place a veil of illusions over reality? So, we do not accept the fact that we are animals, and to mask this reality, to conceal it from our consciousness, we create illusions, cultural artifices. Love is a cultural artifice, and romantic seduction is the strategy humans use to forget that when they're attracted to someone of the opposite sex, what they really desire, deep down, is to reproduce with them. Seduction is a roundabout path to reproduction, which ultimately means the perpetuation of the species. So, just keep in mind, ladies, that when a guy's flirting with you, what he's really doing is trying to keep the species going through you. And if you go along with it, you're agreeing to do the same through him. Basically, the whole process of seduction is like a maze. It's all about getting to the sexual act, but it also tries to make you forget that that's the real goal. And that's why Schopenhauer has a problem with human beings, because he has a problem with hypocrisy. Hypocrisy, because when we seduce, we do everything to hide our real intentions. We do everything to cover up the destination we hope the seduction will lead to, the bedroom. That's the real end goal. The rest, smiles, compliments, attention, are just decoration. They're the garlands we place on our instincts to forget that we're driven by them, to forget that at the core, we're still animals. By the way, Schopenhauer has an amusing phrase. He says, "It is after copulation that the devil's laughter is heard." What he means is that it's after the sexual act is finished that one becomes aware of its absurdity. He seems to be referring more to men here, though the feeling could apply to anyone. After sex, the feeling of shame that overwhelms humans is actually a moment of lucidity, a realization of our animality. And this animality, this raw and primitive force that shows itself through sexual instinct, in a totally irrational and uncontrolled way, is the will. So love is nature's trick, the will's trick, to make us consent to the endless repetition of the cycle of life. But at the root of love, at the root of all desire for union, lies sexual instinct. Sexual instinct is the alpha and omega of life. And I quote, "Sexual passion is the cause of war and the end of peace, the basis of what is serious and the aim of the jest, the inexhaustible source of wit, the key to all illusions and the meaning of all mysterious hints, of all unspoken offers and all stolen glances, the daily meditation of the young and often also of the old, the hourly thought of the unchaste and even against their will, the constantly recurring imagination of the chaste, the ever-ready material of a joke, just because the profoundest seriousness lies at its foundation. It is, however, the piquant element in the joke of life that the chief concern of all men is secretly pursued and ostensibly ignored as much as possible. Indeed, one may say, man is concrete sexual desire, for his origin is an act of copulation, and his wish of wishes is an act of copulation, and this tendency alone perpetuates and holds together his whole phenomenal existence. The will to live manifests itself indeed primarily as an effort to sustain the individual. Yet this is only a step to the effort to sustain the species, and the latter endeavor must be more powerful in proportion as the life of the species surpasses that of the individual in duration, extension, and value. Therefore, sexual passion is the most perfect manifestation of the will to live. For Schopenhauer, existence is a tragedy. It's a tragedy because life is absurd, and yet we do everything we can to perpetuate this absurdity. Life isn't just absurd, it's also a source of suffering. Life, Schopenhauer tells us, oscillates like a pendulum, from suffering to boredom. And because existence is a tragedy, it's something that must eventually come to an end. For Schopenhauer, it's very clear. We must stop reproducing. We must stop participating in this endless perpetuation of the will, which is nothing but a cycle of suffering and unhappiness. Life might offer a few rare moments of happiness, like the joy of aesthetic contemplation. But beyond that, there's nothing to hope for in life, nothing to hope for in an absurd world, nothing to hope for from a world of suffering. On that note, enjoy life.